It's always, I realise now that I have pitched my talk very, very poorly because we've just had three excellent speakers talking about inspiration and uplift and all this wonderful stuff, and I'm here to go, everything's broken, we're all screwed, and I don't know what to do about it. It's kind of a harsh act to follow, and that's, I guess that's a constant vibe I have in cybersecurity. So firstly, thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the sponsors and to the organisers for inviting me to talk. It is an honour to be here. I love talking about stuff like this. But a couple of housekeeping things. If you haven't already noticed, I tend to speak very quickly. I don't tend to stop. And because it's dark up the front, I won't notice if you have questions. I'll be hanging around afterwards though, or you can send me an email, or you can tweet at me on Twitter, and I will probably reply in 6 to 9 months. Don't tend to check Twitter very often. It seems to be a cesspool. So when I pitched this talk, I was trying to figure out what to put in, because I could be like, I can cover the security basics, have passwords, don't tell them to your grandmother and get her to post them online. Cool, great, inspirational stuff. My wife asked me to take that bit of the talk out. So instead, I've put together a hideously complicated talk called Security in 6 Parts. Don't worry, it won't be as much like pulling teeth as that sounds. What I really want to do is I want to revisit some of the major cybersecurity stories, if you like, of 2021. Why 2021? Well, I wanted to go back to the beginning of 2020, and I got to the beginning of 2021, I was like, that is already way too much content. There has been disaster after disaster that we should probably talk about, and 2021 is as far back as I could go without running this into a 3-hour-long presentation. I do, however, run longer courses for ITP, so come and do them if you want to talk about things prior to 2021, or hit me up on Twitter. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we found while security testing at ZX, who I will introduce in a moment, and specifically what we are finding around Azure and AWS instances from a security perspective. I have not done that work. A colleague of mine, Blaze, has done that, and it's part of a much, much longer, more interesting talk that he gives more regularly. His contact details are in the slides, and these slides will be available afterwards. All of the links and references and things are in those. So, let's get into it, let's get started as he keeps an eye on time. Part 1. Me standing on some dude's shoulders. Right, what does this have to do with anything to do with cybersecurity? So, as we said, my background is actually at academia. I came through Victoria, studied there, lectured there for a little while, went to Cybertoa, and I've been at my current employer, which is ZX Security, for a little over 6 months now. I absolutely love it. We are a penetration testing, red teaming company. So we hack stuff for fun and profit. It is a great industry to be in, and it's a super interesting job for someone like me, who loves to learn new things and loves to learn new ways to break existing things. We do absolutely all aspects of penetration testing, from red teaming through to cloud security assessments and other things, which brings me to why am I standing on someone's shoulders in a photo on this slide. Security's rough. Right, we hear a lot in the media about new breach, new 0-day, new ransomware crew, pretty much every day. Like, I rewrote this talk a couple of times, even within the last couple of weeks, because of new stories that are coming out. And it is really, really hard just to keep our knowledge up with what is actually happening in cybersecurity at the moment, from a defender's and from an attacker's perspective. And a lot of that can cause people to focus time, effort, and attention in the wrong place. And that brings me to one of my core topics today, which is risk. The core of cybersecurity in all the courses that I teach, and my own personal belief, is that all security should really be discussed in the context of risk. Not in the context of, hey, this story is on social media at the moment, or hey, my friend Jeff got ransomware. And it's because there is so much information out there, it is hard to know what is relevant, and risk should help us figure that out. So I approach security the same way I do something in my spare time, which is circus. I am a circus performer. Here is a plug. There is an amazing circus performance tonight at the gala on this very stage. Come and watch them. They're the Boomtown Acrobats. They're amazing. They're far more coordinated than I am. But my approach to security is the same as my approach to circus. It is risk. The sensible thing would be to not do circus. Don't stand on someone's shoulders. You'll fall and hurt yourself. Right? It's not rocket science. It's probably reasonably obvious to you. It's not super obvious to me. But to that I say, screw it, I want to do circus. It's fun. It keeps me outside. I meet new people. I stand on their shoulders. Or they stand on mine. It's weird. But the point is, just not doing something because it's risky isn't really an option. And it's the same for IT. We can't just not develop new software. We can't not release new products. We can't not onboard new staff. And all of these are security risks. We have to figure out a way to do these things and do them securely rather than just not doing them at all. The biggest issue is humans suck at risk. And we think we're really, really good at it. And I'm not going to take you down a pop psychology pathway because I'm not a psychologist and I'd just be lying to you and putting big words on it. But the reality is humans have a number of mental deficiencies where we are bad at estimating risk, but we think that we're good at it, right? And it's a real problem in security that we need to be aware of. So how do I deal with risk? I think the best way to deal with risk in security is to try to keep up with as much information as you can actually absorb. And that last bit is reasonably tricky. So how do I do it? I listen to 2 podcasts. One of them is fortnightly, one of them is weekly. And I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. I'm saying I've got around about 2 hours of free time in my commute each week. And if I can use that to keep my knowledge up to date, that is really valuable time spent. From a risk perspective, it means I'm going to be making more informed decisions and I'm going to be making more informed advice to my clients. So Darknet Diaries is a fantastic US podcast that talks about, it actually interviews attackers and ransomware crews. It talks about how they do what they do. Risky Business is run out of Australia with a co-host from Insomnia Security, Adam Boileau. It's a fantastic, about half-hour-long weekly podcast that explains what are the major cybersecurity stories and are you actually at risk from them. Because a big problem we have in the media is a story will come out and will say the sky is falling, all of Microsoft is on fire, and that will rightly cause a lot of people to panic. And then when you dig into the story, it will actually be like, no, this very small subset of Microsoft's customers were slightly impacted for half an hour. And it's really hard to actually figure out which one of those scenarios you're in if all you do is consume media from stuff. So listen to these podcasts if you can. I get no money, no kickbacks from saying this. They're just fantastic. There are a few other ones out there. There's a fantastic one called The Lazarus Heist from the BBC World Service at the moment. If you're interested about the North Korean hacking crew and ransomware crews, I could go on all day, but I'm going to keep things rolling and move on to part 2. Because it has been a year in cybersecurity. I guess it is every year, but this year seems particularly interesting. I feel like every week we get a new cybersecurity story. And I want to take just a few minutes to remind you of all the mad stuff that has happened in 2021 from security. Because when I came to write this talk, I had forgotten half of it. And it's only July. So as a reminder, hopefully we haven't forgotten this one. One of the major pipelines in the US was shut down for multiple days because a criminal ransomware crew broke into it, ransomwared everything, and then effectively caused a ransom to be paid of around about US $4 million. Most of that was later recovered, but that's not really the point here. The point here is attackers are, they've got some lofty financial goals. I think, $4 million for a week's roughly worth of downtime and probably a few months worth of work is a pretty decent paycheck, even if they didn't get away with it all. As another example, also from late May, we're not even going back to the beginning of 2021, one of the world's largest cyber insurance companies was hit by a ransomware crew, a criminal crew, a week after they had announced they are not going to pay cybersecurity ransoms as part of their insurance coverage anymore. Sucks to be them. Something slightly closer to home, which I'm going to come back to. The Irish government health service was hit by a wide variety of ransomware attacks. They are still experiencing disruptions almost 2 months later. They have not paid any of the ransom. And they are still struggling. We'll come back to health stuff in a little bit. At the end of last year, at the beginning of this year, a bunch of vulnerabilities in a bunch of different Microsoft products were exploited by a variety of different ransomware crews to such a degree that the American FBI logged into systems that they had no permission to do and automatically patched the issues for American companies. That's how severe it was. And they just left a nice little note saying, yeah, we fixed your stuff. That's mad, right? It's completely mad that the government's just like, nah, we're not going to ask, we're just going to fix your shit. And I'd completely forgotten that happened. Closer to home, the Reserve Bank got breached. Sure, that was technically December 24th through the January 7th of this year. I forgot that happened. And no, they weren't specifically targeted. They were part of a larger breach. But the firm involved with that, it turns out, didn't actually alert the Reserve Bank when they already knew that this breach was going on. And when they did alert them, they said that the bank wasn't involved when they actually were. It's kind of mad. Acer, one of the biggest computer companies in the world, $50 million worth of ransomware. It's not like a mum and pop shop company with 2 employees and Jeff from down the road who's doing security. If companies this size are getting ransomware, this is important. 2 others, just bringing us up to date within the last fortnight, Kaseya and JBS, an international meat packaging company, were both ransomware, both by criminal ransomware organizations and extorted for multiple millions of dollars. In both cases, ransoms were paid to the ransomers. And just to kind of round the horrific things off, of course, ransomware crews are ballsy enough now that they go after police departments. And negotiations broke down with a police department when you're threatening them with ransomware. I don't understand why that is a surprising thing. Surely they would not have thought that the police paid. But unfortunately, the result of that was that a bunch of sensitive information about officers from the Metropolitan Police Department was released. This has been the last 6 months, just the stuff that I cut it down to put into this talk. And the thing about all of these companies is that on all of their websites, they have some paraphrase of the statement that we care deeply about security. And standing here nice and safe in reasonably COVID-free New Zealand, it is very, very easy and very, very tempting for me to point the finger and go, you suck at security. You don't really care. You just didn't put any effort into it. And that's why ransomware crews got in and broke all your stuff. And that brings me to a pretty major point that I think we need to talk about with security, and that is the idea of victim shaming. It seems very, very common, particularly in the media and sometimes from industry as well, and I don't think it's helpful. Let's be really, really clear. Pretty much every story that I just put up was the result of a very well organized, very well funded, sophisticated criminal organization taking advantage of a company or a variety of individuals. If this was any other industry, we probably wouldn't point the finger at the victim and say it's their fault, right? This is organized crime on a global scale. And so really a better question is not what should the victims have done, but really what can we all do a little bit better to help stop organizations like this? Because the reality is that from the cybersecurity, well, I guess the largest change in cybersecurity that we've seen over the last 3 years is this move from low-level, generic, automated attacks. If you cast your minds back to the heady heyday of 2016, 2017, you may remember that the NHS and a bunch of other organizations worldwide were hit by something called WannaCry, or NotPetya. It was kind of earlier stage ransomware. The things about those is they were worms. They were autonomous things that ran out on their own, found vulnerable systems, compromised them, and ransomwared them. There was a human involved at the beginning of that chain, but once the infection started to spread, it was reasonably autonomous. That is not what we seem to be dealing with today. Because of the effectiveness of some of those earlier ransomware campaigns, we are now seeing criminal organizations spin up entire ransomware crews. And this is not just limited to cybersecurity, this is across all of crime, but I think it's most obvious in cybersecurity and the attacks that we are seeing. And here is the reality of modern cybersecurity. Defenders are not defending against isolated attackers, isolated individuals. Jeff, who spends 24 hours a day typing and not going outside, right? That maybe was never a reality. It's certainly not a reality today. The reality is we are now trying to defend against ransomware businesses. And they are businesses in every stage of the word. They have stakeholders. They have key performance indicators. They have staff reviews. They have managers, right? They are organizations. They are well-structured, well-funded. They can be anywhere in the world, although, of course, China and Russia and North Korea get a lot of airtime here. And I don't have enough time to delve into this in heaps of detail, but my colleague Carrot from ITx Security has written up a really detailed exploration of current ransomware methodology and ransomware maturity models, a kind of defensive approach. It's up on our website. Here is the start of the post if you want to go and take a closer look at it. I highly encourage you to have a read if you're worried about what does modern ransomware look like and how do we protect against it. Dave's done a far better job than I could here. But let me give you the cliff notes. The reality is, even though I've just told you that ransomware crews are organized and targeting organizations and everything is terrifying, they're actually not developing a lot that is brand new. For a lot of the attacks that we have heard about previously, the entry point is the same as it's always been. It is someone sending a malicious file that then infects a computer. Most commonly, that is delivered still in 2021 via email. It's still malicious attachments or clicking on a malicious link. It is not always via email now. I guess we're seeing some crews use WhatsApp or any other kind of technical messaging platform, but the general idea is the same, sending the target a malicious file. And in almost every single one of those instances I've mentioned, this is the kind of attack where they first breach the organization's perimeter. There are a few other attacks that work here. So watering hole, which is compromising a system of the organization that staff use, maybe a staff intranet page, and then uploading something malicious to that, or compromising the company's main website and getting people to visit that. But vastly the most common delivery mechanism is still via email. And it's still effective because we're human, right? Phishing and ransomware delivery via email isn't just common because it's easy, it's common because it works. Here is some data from CoveWave alongside Sophos, which just surveys individuals and organizations that have been a target of ransomware over the last few years. And they've been tracking what forms of delivery ransomware takes. And we've seen a massive drop over the last few years from RDP, which is your remote desktop applications and things like that. It's dropped right the way down, and email delivery and email phishing of ransomware or other kinds of malware is on the rise. Even with better and better email filtering and things, it's still a very, very common attack vector because it works. So if the worst happens and you get ransomware in 2021, what does that look like? It depends where you are in the world, but here are some rough figures from that same report. Generally speaking, the average ransomware payment that is requested is somewhere between US $10,000 and US $200,000. Ransomware's crews have done their homework. They are aware of who their targets are, and so they tune the payment to match the actual bottom line of the organization. There is no point for a criminal enterprise to target your organization with a ransomware that is too large for you to pay. They want you to pay it. Their manager is going to be breathing down their necks if they don't find a way for you to pay them that money. And so by far the most common ransomware request and successful payment is around about US $10,000. Now sure, those aren't the ones that appear on the first page of stuff, but they are certainly the most effective ones, and they are the ones that generate the largest amount of baseline for some of these criminal organizations. The important point of all of those organizations that did pay the ransom, though, is that less than 10% after paying the ransom actually got their data decrypted for a variety of different reasons. Now, some of the bigger ransomware crews go out and they try to have really good customer service. They will help you decrypt your stuff, right? Because otherwise, what's the point in you paying? There is branding war in these criminal organizations where they try to get a good reputation for decrypting systems to encourage people to pay the ransom. Generally though, just don't pay the ransom. Try not to get in that position, but if you do, paying the ransom should be an absolute last resort. And so I've been talking a lot about ransomware and New Zealand organizations and things, and hopefully some of you are going, isn't there a story that you really should be talking more about right now? So yeah, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, let's not. The reason I didn't put the Waikato DHP ransomware attack in my original series of slides is that, for me at least, I know very little accurate information about the compromise in the DHB. The limit of my knowledge, the limit of official statements that have been put out by the Waikato DHP, to my knowledge, and again, this might be a week out of date, is that we believe that email was used to deliver some ransomware, which was disguised as an email attachment, and we believe it was probably the Zeppelin ransomware, which is ransomware that you can buy. It's part of a Ransomware-as-a-service deal. That's where my knowledge of the actual technical detail of the Waikato DHB hack stops. That has not stopped other people from talking about it though. I was in Nelson 2 weeks ago and the taxi driver told me a detailed technical breakdown of everything that happened inside the Waikato DHB attack. And I was sitting there going, cool. How do you, what? Apparently he picked up someone that talked to John who was from HR in Waikato. I'm just saying, I'm not going to talk any more about this because the reality is I don't know what happened. I would love to talk about it. I hope we get a detailed breakdown so we can learn from this at some point, but I don't think we have that information yet. And unless someone has a better data source than me, which is very, very possible, be a little bit careful about the information that we are consuming about that, and before we, I guess, take too much joy in pointing fingers at, again, what seems to be a criminal enterprise targeting a health organization. I think it's dangerous to demonize Waikato DHB here. It's the criminal organization that is doing the bad thing. They just happen to get targeted. And this actually brings me to a point that is not in my slides. A common misconception about cybersecurity that I've spoken to for small to medium enterprises is attackers would not target me. Now, why would an attacker target me? I don't make enough money. I'm not a valuable enough target. I don't have valuable enough clients. And sure, some of that kind of flows logically, but the reality is actually flipped. Most of these crews don't go for looking for targets. They go looking for vulnerabilities, and then the crews use the tools and tool sets and skills that they have to make money off the vulnerabilities that they find. So don't think that because you're not ASA that you're not a target. It's simply, if you have a vulnerability that these attackers can exploit, they will try to find a way to make money off of you. That could be via ransomware, or it could be via a variety of other vectors. So where do we get information about cyber attacks in New Zealand? Well, here is my pitch for please, if you are involved in a cybersecurity incident, report it to the New Zealand Computer Emergency Response Team, CERT-NZ. They produce quarterly reports talking about what attacks are going on, what protections we can put in place, and giving organisations advice. If you've ever been on any one of my courses, you'll notice, you'll be very, very familiar with this. But just to give you an idea, this is the kind of scale that NZ CERT is reporting for 2021. An average direct financial loss of around about 4 million from a cyber attack. The Reserve Bank, from that breach, from the Excellion breach that I mentioned earlier, estimates a total cost to them of about $3.5 million. That is not the cost of paying the attackers, that is just the organisational cost of recovery, including internal and external experts. There's a write-up on the Reserve Bank website, which I read this morning, which is a really nice breakdown if you want to look at the actual financial baselines, costs of some of these attacks. So in the NZ CERT quarterly report, they do point out the same thing that I have already said earlier, but I'm a big fan of repeating key information, so let's go through it again. Phishing and credential harvesting, scams and fraud are the most common forms of cyber attack still. They are common because they work. They often help to get a foot in the door, and yes, in late 2020, we did see a massive increase in the amount of malware that was reported to NZ CERT. But it seems to me, from looking at the data around it, that that may have been a one-off. This pattern here, oops, this is going backwards. This pattern here where scams, fraud, phishing, and credential harvesting vastly outnumber every other form of cyber attack. Yes, even ransomware, which is way down here, is the thing that we should probably be aware of. And by that, I mean have a plan for when one of your staff gets phished. It will happen. I have been phished multiple times, and I will be phished again, even though I try to be really, really aware of cybersecurity. Just expecting our staff and our contractors to be 100% perfect all of the time is completely unrealistic. You need to have a plan for what happens if things fall over. This is pretty much the same information. Go and have a look at the rest of the NZ Cert report if you want more information. The other thing to remember is that while, as an attacker, I'm usually interested in your password hashes or any kind of hash, any kind of encrypted thing, secret, that I can get my hands on is also really, really valuable. And just because I like repeating information, as a reminder, this slide is about 5 years old now, it's put up by everyone. Password length matters. Password complexity matters. I'll give you some examples of why, but how about I throw one more news story from 2021 in there? Did anyone forget about this? I didn't. So a couple of months ago, the largest database credential dump of all time was dumped on the internet. It contains 100 gigabytes of usernames and passwords, stretching back decades. I am personally in there with my personal email address and both my secure and my insecure password, because yeah, I used to do that. I used to have that. They're both in there. So if you get a chance, go and look yourself up on there and see what has been breached, because you would be surprised how many of your commonly used passwords are already known to attackers. As an aside, if you remember back to the Colonial Pipeline attack I mentioned at the very, very beginning, the way the attackers breached the defenses there is they found a system administrator's password online and used that to log in to their remote desktop. The system administrator didn't even work for the company anymore. They left multiple years before. Their account just still happened to be active. But that's why it's worth remembering to disable accounts when people leave, but also to be aware of what information is out there about you online. So what can you do about it? Well, I've mentioned a bunch of this before, but you can report it to NZ Cert. Generally, if you're phishing, if you're worried about phishing, contact the person that you are getting a request from via a different channel and check that it is actually from them. If you're worried about ransomware, make sure you have backups. It's really the only defense that consistently works. Make sure you check your backups. The American Police Department that was hit a couple of weeks ago, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting its exact name right now, was ransomware, said, we're not going to pay the ransom, we're at a police department. We got backups. Went to restore from backups, and their backups hadn't been working for the previous 9 months. Right? Please check your backups. It happens to all of us, and practice restoring from them. Run a regular exercise where you restore key systems from backups. It is the simplest, cheapest, most effective way to ensure you're resistant to a wide variety of other cyber attacks. Again, more details are available on the DDOS Security website here, but they're pretty basic. Keep systems up to date as much as possible. Have an antivirus. Nothing that you won't have heard before. If you are particularly technically savvy, there are third-party decryption tools for certain ransomwares that are available. If you know what you're doing, you can take the risk and try to use it. Be aware, criminal organizations are also very aware that these tools are very valuable, and it seems to me like this would be a great way to get more malware into a target. Just saying. And finally, generally, only pay ransoms as a last resort. If you could be in a position where a key system could be ransomware and you're not sure that you'd be able to cover it, maybe have the conversation about whether you should pay the ransom earlier rather than doing it in the throes of an actual cyber attack. Raise it earlier and see if there is any reason why you might have to pay it, and try to avoid that wherever possible. And if you are ever recovering, always rebuild any infected machine. Don't just restore from backups. Ransomware crews are very aware of how useful backups are, and they typically are one of the first things that they target. In terms of what you can do preventatively, again, NZ-Cert produces an annual list of key things organisations can do to protect against not just ransomware, but a variety of other forms of cyber attacks. They've just released the updated list for 2021. Generally speaking, the list doesn't change heaps each year. They have about 2 changes each year, so the 2 ones in blue here are the new changes from 2021. Which are just clarification, really, of the 2020 critical controls. So go and make sure that you have at least some of those. For reference, in the slides, I've also included the list of critical controls from 2020. If you're interested in assessing how well your organisation is doing, then you might actually be interested in the Australian version. They have 8 instead of 10, and as of last week, the Australian Signals Directorate have released a maturity model, an updated, maturity model for each of those 8 key areas that allow you to look at your organisation and go, are we level 0, are we level 3, where do we want to be for those? It's a really, really fantastic tool with some really specific action points about how you can get started on that ladder or how you can improve your maturity if you're already on the way, if you already have some of these things deployed in your organisations. But generally, don't reuse passwords, talk to NZ-Cert whenever you can, keep backups and keep things as up to date as possible. So, because I'm rapidly running out of time, I'm going to cover some of the most interesting things we've found recently at ZX. And unfortunately, it hasn't been me breaking into and ransomwaring clients. That tends to be frowned on. The reality is, most of my work is finding weak passwords or weak credentials and using them to log into a system. I would love to be able to tell you that I'm some kind of computer super genius and I find 0 days in Microsoft Azure every day and I'm just in there breaking. No, I guess welcome 1, password 1, and about 50% of the time on a key system it will work. That's most of my job. The reality is, for us at ZX, most of our customers' systems are still very focused on external defense, and they are reasonably well hardened, because if they weren't, they'd probably already have some form of infection or ransomware. But as soon as we breach that perimeter, most of our targets, most of our clients, most of the organizations that we work with are soft and squishy and very easy to further exploit because defenses are still focused at the external interface. Even though a lot of organizations are using cloud systems and cloud options, we still see the same kind of phenomena come up time and time again. Why is this so juicy? Well, once I'm inside a system, I have a million more things that I can do to compromise it than I can when I'm just sitting on an internet. They range from things like sniffing, which is literally just pulling passwords or encrypted traffic off of the network, through to just looking around for stuff that's lying around that's juicy. In the job I was on last week, I found 3 password dumps called password.txt, oh no, sorry, 2, one was called password.csv, on the desktop of the user that I was on. Please don't leave passwords or other keys like SSH keys and credentials lying around. Don't put them in GitHub, because once they're in GitHub, they're there forever. The reality is, I know I'm repeating this a lot, but I need to drive the point home. When I get into an organization and I dump a list of encrypted credentials, my experience is that we can crack over half of them within a couple of hours because key systems are using weak passwords. And I'm not just talking about your user passwords here. I'm also talking about passwords for things like system accounts. Often they were set long before new password strength requirements were implemented, and they may not have been updated. Go and check those. And please, don't use company name 1 as a password. We've seen it a lot, and we still see it all the time. So in terms of more interesting kind of unique things that we are finding at ZX within the last kind of 6 months, multi-factor bypasses are quite a big thing. If you're using, my wife made me say this, if you're using the Microsoft Authenticator app or Google Authenticator, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about a lot of other organizations that roll their own multi-factor. It turns out in many multi-factor cases, you can just guess the verification code as many times as you want, and often that will let you bypass multi-factor authentication, which otherwise protects against a whole variety of other attacks. We're seeing a lot of organizations use this tool called GraphQL, which I love. It's a really, really cool system. The problem is, if you're not familiar with it, it's an interface to an SQL backend. And if you cast your mind back 40 years, the critical issue with SQL was that you could inject stuff into SQL. And it turns out nothing on the internet is new, and that is still very much a thing in 2021. I found that twice this year alone. And SQL injection is actually what allowed the Kaseya crew to get in and ransomware all the Kaseya systems last week. My favorite of the weird things that we found this year is it turns out PDF generators on websites are a pretty major security vulnerability. A lot of the back-end libraries that these things use allow attackers to embed code and then execute commands. And if you're hosting that on AWS or Google Cloud or Azure, you can use those commands to query the internal metadata servers and get credentials and get into the system. I was able to use this twice this year to get full remote control of a target's Amazon Web Services entire private cloud. That is how bad these things can be. So, if you are in the software development game, what can you do rather than just panicking and looking for those three things? Well, there is a variety of free tools out there. Come on some of the ITP security courses, we can give you more details, but OWASP has a variety of other tools, and they have this fantastic framework called the OWASP Application Security Verification Standard, which is a sanity checklist for different parts of application security. Go check it out, some really, really good content there. So, and I'm going to finish up actually on part 5, so I don't run over time, because part 6 is just FAQs that you can ask me later. This is part of a talk that my colleague Blaze has given over the last 6 months, looking at all of the security reviews we have done on AWS and Azure systems, just talking about general trends. What we found overwhelmingly with AWS is that vulnerabilities in AWS are almost always at the identity and access management side of things, and to a lesser degree in monitoring. The critical vulnerabilities that we found, one of them that I've already spoken about, allowed us to get into metadata via the PDF generator on a website. One was just a bucket that was world writable. Don't do that. Don't allow your website to be written by anyone, anywhere in the world. Just probably some good advice. And another one, as I said, we found the keys in GitHub. Not super hard stuff. We've also generally found administrator roles tend to be given to far too many people or used too liberally, and a lack of multi-factor authentication. If you want the details of that, the slides are available on the ZX Security website, or you can reach out to Blaze, whose details are on those slides. The same kind of questions for Azure. Generally speaking, the same thing, with the caveat that Azure has learned from a lot of the early mistakes that AWS has made. So in the security reviews of Azure that we've done, we have found that a lack of monitoring is consistently the largest issue, and some poor service configurations. By that, I mean, generally speaking, key accounts are missing multi-factor authentication. That is by far our most common and most kind of critical finding for all cloud service reviews that we do, followed closely by accounts being overly permissive or just having too many administrators with too much access. The other gotcha with Azure is that typically, beyond what I just said, the main vulnerability we find is the connection between Azure AD and the local AD that organizations tend to be coming from. Azure AD and on-prem AD are very, very different beasts. Just be aware that connecting the two is often the easiest way for me to compromise your Azure environment. And then Blaze makes a couple of excellent notes about monitoring defaults on Azure. Make sure they're turned on. Make sure you have a look at your logs. Don't just collect them, or you'll end up with a massive bill and not a lot to show for it. Okay. And so I think I will finish up there with one final plug. I pretty much only talked about ransomware and cloud stuff. If you're interested in other forms of cyber attack, my colleagues have written a variety of other ransomware, DOS, other security maturity models talking about basic competencies in those key areas. You can find all of those on the ZX Security websites, and they're really, really good quality content. And I think I will finish up there. I'll stick around for morning tea and lunch, so do feel free to come and grab me, tweet at me, or ask me any questions. Other than that, thank you so much for your attention. It's been lovely speaking to everyone.